In uncertain times and rough waters, we start to reminisce about a simpler time. A time in the past we feel nostalgic for. But do we really even know why we are feeling it? The textbook definition of nostalgia is a sentimental longing, yearning, or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. What comes up for me when I hear this definition is that when we are nostalgic for something, it brings up positive feelings to the point where it feels like we are wearing rose-colored glasses. We miss the good parts of that time, but we may be forgetting the parts that maybe weren't so great. Take old-fashioned trends from the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. Low-waist flared jeans, bucket hats, frosted tips, and Twilight's Bella Swan attire. To some, these trends are in again, but to others, they are cringe. Past trends like these will keep coming back into popularity as time goes on. So it only makes sense that old trends from photography would come back. Film has made a huge resurgence, causing the production of film to go up and at times struggling to meet demand. People are buying decade-old cameras and becoming enamored with photos that look like they were taken long ago. I think it's safe to say that the current climate of photography culture is overcome with nostalgia. I think this has to do with the culture currently embracing imperfections that newer cameras don't have very much of. Sony, Canon, Fujifilm, and Nikon are making incredible flagship cameras that produce images that are essentially perfect. They hardly ever miss. As wonderful as that is for professional use, it's not always very interesting. Older cameras have an older quality that adds unique character to an image that is fundamentally different compared to newer cameras on the market. And I think this trend is what fueled my intrigue in older Fujifilm cameras. The aesthetic, the style, the charm, the retro feel, it's all so alluring and interesting. I wanted in on the trend. I wanted to create my own images that could give me a sense of nostalgia for a time when I wasn't even a photographer. I wanted to feel enamored with imperfect beauty and be transferred back in time. I wanted to be invigorated to create. So I decided to purchase my first Fujifilm camera because I could feel that the essence of Fujifilm cameras was special. Their cameras do something especially unique, and I wanted to figure out exactly what that was. With careful consideration, I ultimately landed on the X-T10 for 4 reasons. The affordable price, its X-Trans 2 sensor, which I will say more about later, the nostalgic character of its images, and its compact form factor. And now that I've used the Fujifilm X-T10 for over 5 months now, I finally am ready to give you my honest experience of using this camera and whether it was worth the purchase. The Fujifilm X-T10 came out in 2015, which is a whole decade ago, and at the time it was considered the cheaper, smaller, and stripped-down version of Fujifilm's flagship at the time, the X-T1. They both have the infamous Fujifilm 16-megapixel APS-C CMOS X-Trans 2 sensor. I know that's a mouthful, but let me get into why I'm mentioning it. This sensor is considered the best sensor Fujifilm ever made because of the way it produces images. Fujifilm fans say it has a character to it that is unique compared to Fujifilm's latest sensors. I personally can't tell the difference, but that's because I don't have the other sensors to compare it to. But ultimately, I took their word for it and I gave it a shot. Its 16-megapixel sensor can also record 1080p video up to 60 frames per second. It includes a 3-inch articulating LCD screen and a 2360-dot OLED viewfinder. It also has 77 phase detection, autofocus tracking points, a pop-up flash, and a mechanical shutter. You can see the rest of the specs up here on the screen. The X-T10 has Fujifilm's iconic design. Its design is what allured me to want to purchase one in the first place. The silver aluminum paired with the rough black texture, the iconic Fujifilm logo, the textured metal dials, and all the little switches and customizable options. It just screams classy. It looks like a vintage film camera. One time when I was out shooting, a guy asked if I was carrying a Leica, and I think that says it all. The thing I think that I adore most, though, about this camera is the sound it makes. The sound of this shutter is addicting and so satisfying. When I think of this camera, I think of the sound of that shutter. Ultimately, I just love the way the camera feels in my hand, and I love the way I look holding it. I look like an artsy photographer, and as an artist, it feels nice to feel seen as one. Finally, I like how small and compact it is. One of the key reasons I went with the X-T10 over the X-T1 was that the X-T1 was just a little too big. I wanted an everyday carry camera that wasn't as bulky as my Sony a7 III. And the X-T1 was about roughly the same size as my Sony a7 III, so that really wasn't gonna work for me. Ultimately, the X-T10's design makes this camera a truly fun sensory experience, and I think that's why I like the camera so much. One of the most important things to me in a camera is the image quality, and I'm not saying it needs to be the best image quality. When I think of image quality, I think, how does this camera capture what it sees differently than other cameras? And does it do it well? The Fujifilm X-T10 has a very unique way of handling what it captures, and I will certainly fail to accurately describe its character, but I'm going to try. The images specifically coming out of the X-T10 feel timeless. There's something about the way the sensor handles the black point and the contrast in an image that makes the image feel glassy. Another word that comes to mind is crispy, like the images feel crisp and look crisp. And what I mean is that the images feel crispy. It feels punchy. The details are also sharp, but when I say crisp, it's more of a feeling rather than a descriptor of detail. The way I like to explain it is that the attitude of the image is trying to wow you. It pops out at you. My Sony a7 III just captures what it sees and lets you do the work afterward to add character to it in the editing room. But Fujifilm interprets the image for you, and that's partly thanks to its film simulations. Fujifilm has film simulation presets built into the camera. They are essentially like little filters you can see applied to your image in real time. These film simulations combined with the X-Trans 2 sensor create images that feel like you are being transported back in time. It really does do a great job of simulating a filmic look. But let me be clear, I think the film simulations do a great job of simulating images that give the color appearance of film. I wouldn't say that they totally make your images look like they were shot on film, but the simulations create color profiles that have a filmic vibe. Overall, the images I've taken on this camera have indeed fulfilled the nostalgic vibe I have been looking for. And I've taken enough to feel like I've been transported back in time to an era that I didn't even live in. For a camera released in 2015, I was pleasantly surprised with the autofocus in this camera. It has been generally very snappy in single autofocus mode, and at times it has even locked onto tiny airplanes and birds in the sky. Continuous autofocus isn't the greatest, but I personally haven't really needed to use it, so single autofocus has been more than sufficient for my needs. I never expected it to be able to handle autofocus so well, so I was personally impressed. And it will get the job done if you decide to get this camera. Also, its low light performance is spectacular. The raw photos hold a lot of information in the shadows and in the highlights, so it's easy to recover information either to get a balanced image if I am under or overexposed. I feel like I have shot at all times of the day and it can handle everything I've been able to throw at it. Truthfully, I have not been let down by really any image I've taken so far, and that makes this camera a winner in my book. One weird thing that I found myself a little annoyed with was navigating the dials. I really do like the tactile nature of using them and the way it slows down the experience. However, I did find myself wanting to change the shutter speed quickly in a pinch, but wasn't able to turn it fast enough to capture the image. On a Sony camera, I have fast turning dials that move very quickly and are ergonomically placed. The X-T10's dials have a satisfying click because it's hard to turn, but because of that, you aren't going to be moving very fast. They are also positioned at the top of the camera, and that can be hard to maneuver around when you are looking through the viewfinder. I also didn't find them particularly more useful than just using custom buttons to adjust the settings. It felt more like a way to attract you to the design more than actually a useful function of the camera. I realize that it's just my opinion though, so I know that there are plenty of people online who find them to be quite functional. It just wasn't really as much for me. The first thing I'd change without hesitation is the screen. It's not the best in bright sunlight, and it's so reflective because the screen is not laminated. And thankfully, the images do look good on the screen when you look at them indoors, but outdoors, it can be difficult to see what you captured. I would not be able to use this camera without a viewfinder, and thankfully it is an OLED viewfinder, which makes it vibrant and easy to see. And because the screen is not laminated, it just makes the camera feel old. And not in a good way, like in an I'm using a camera from 2015 way. It's also just a poor use of space. The screen could have been much bigger, but I'll give it a pass since this is an older camera. The next thing I change is I just wish that this camera had a higher megapixel count. If it was 24 or even 20 megapixels, I'd feel like I'd have a lot more room to work with. 16 megapixels in 2025 is just too low in my opinion. It's okay for social media, but there are times that when I want to crop in, I can't because the image just starts to fall apart. The upside of it being 16 megapixels, however, is that the images can simulate film better because the images aren't overly detailed and packed with too much information. Even so, it would be nice to have more pixels to work with. Finally, let's talk about the price. This camera is much more affordable compared to other options for Fujifilm. You can buy used models for around $430 to $450 on MPB, and sometimes you can find it even less on the used market on eBay or Facebook Marketplace. I choose to shop on MPB though because I found them to be a reliable retailer. Hey MPB, consider sponsoring me? Given its price point and everything I've talked about so far, I think the X-T10 is worth it. It is hands down the camera I grab the most when I'm taking photos just for me, and it has become the most reliable everyday carry camera that I have. It's stylish, classy, and nostalgic. It's trendy in the most subtle way, and it does what it's meant to do well. It's a joy to use. The images it produces are sharp, punchy, vibrant, and just outright gorgeous. I feel like an artist when I use this camera, and I feel like that's hard to find in a world where the large amount of cameras that are on the market are used for professional work. It does, however, feel slightly outdated in some ways, like the screen, but its performance, image quality, built-in film simulations, and charm more than outweigh the fact that it's a little outdated. With all that being said, I don't think it has earned the spot of my favorite camera. I think that's still reserved for my Sony RX100, and if you haven't checked out that video, I highly recommend that you click at the top right of this video and check out why it's my favorite. So, did the nostalgia last? Did the camera hold up? I certainly had rose-colored glasses when I bought this camera, and the yearning for an older time helped me dip my toes into Fujifilm's iconic ecosystem. But buying a camera made in 2015 means it's going to have drawbacks that reflect the year of 2015. Low megapixel count, plasticky build, and old, small reflective screen are all part of the deal. Although, the best part about the nostalgia fading is seeing what was really underneath it all along. Yearning. We love to yearn and to hope. It's human to yearn for something we don't have. And sometimes the yearning fuels our creativity. And I say, let it.